I'll just quickly introduce myself, let Maya introduce herself, and then we'll kind of jump in. So my name is Mark Martinez. I am, sorry, I just got a new title and I forget it sometimes. I am the legal counsel and
Mark.
budget director for Senator Pat Jalen of Somerville, and one of the, I guess, co-founders of Beacon BLOC.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Rayner. I am the legislative director for State Senator Sonia Chang Diaz. I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. And I am a founding member of Beacon BLOC. Can't forget that piece. And Mark's going to tell you a little bit about what Beacon BLOC is.
Yeah, so quickly, Beacon BLOC started as a group of progressive staffers that came together to figure out how we could better support ourselves in the work of getting progressive things done at the State House. And then George Floyd was murdered, and much like everything else, everything kind of changed. And in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, we heard the Senate president, the speaker, and pretty much every other legislator, get on Twitter or in front of a camera and talk about how now is the time to listen to Black voices and uplift Black voices and follow the lead of Black people as we create change. And we decided that if that was true, and if that was really their commitment, that needed to start from inside their own house, and it needs to start inside the State House. And so we are a group dedicated to changing the State House to better recruit, retain, and support staffers of color inside of the State House. And that's really kind of the quick and dirty. If people have more questions about Beacon BLOC later, we're happy to answer it. But that's kind of.
And I'll put our website and social media and stuff in the chat.
Yes, we sent an open letter to State House leadership in July, basically with a list of 8 demands that we had that we believed would better create a better environment for staffers of color inside of the State House, and for communities of color just visiting the State House. And so, you can see that, like I said, you can check out our social media and our website and see what those demands were, check up on our progress. And like I said, as always, if we have more questions about Beacon BLOC, we can do that a little bit later. But I think right now what we will do is we'll jump into an overview. So I am going to attempt to share my screen to do kind of in just a couple, prefaces about this. This is kind of a high level review. This is kind of the ideal path through which a bill passes. Anyone that's paid attention to the State House knows that there are a million little intricacies. I've been working in and around the State House for 4 or 5 years now, on and off, and there are still things that happen in that building that confuse me. So, we're going to try to stick to what should be happening and the kind of overall process. But that's why we're, making sure that we leave some time for questions at the end, because I'm sure we've all had experiences that may not completely line up with what I'm about to show you and what I'm about to discuss. And like I said, this is a high level review. So any of the kind of intricacies that we want to dig into after the fact, happy to do that. So let me start.
And like what was noted earlier, today is the last day of the 2019-2020 legislative session. So kind of an exciting day to be talking about the legislative process.
Indeed. All right. So is my screen successfully shared right now? We're good. All right. Yes. So just keep in mind, this is like I said, this is the presentation that I normally give to the interns in our office, but this is kind of the large scale view of the legislative process and a little bit on the legislature in Massachusetts. Again, some of this may be review for you all, but we're just going to start from the beginning. Some kind of basic facts about the State House. The Massachusetts legislature is one of 10 full-time state legislatures. So that means our legislators are, full-time employees. Some of them obviously have other jobs and run other businesses, but, the vast majority of states, may meet a couple months out of the year or a couple months every 2 years to get, all their legislative work done. We, theoretically meet year round. We operate on a 2-year legislative cycle, 160 members of the House of Representatives and 40 members in the Senate. And so this is kind of the general overview of the 2-year legislative cycle, which, as Maya mentioned, one ends today and the next one begins tomorrow. So what will be beginning tomorrow is these first couple of weeks is bill filing. So the vast majority of all of the bills that get discussed on Beacon Hill get filed in the first 2 weeks of the session. This year, the deadline is January 15th. Now, of course, bills get filed after the fact, after that deadline for various reasons, but the vast majority will be filed by January 15th. The next 2 weeks are generally what we just call co-sponsorship. So as I'm sure most of you all are familiar, as being active members of the League of Women Voters, that's when we start, it's when our phones blow up and emails blow up about people letting us know what their priorities are and what, we should be co-sponsoring and what we should be paying attention to. End of February, now again, this is in a normal session. Obviously, COVID threw a lot of this stuff off, but end of February is when the governor will release his budget, and we'll talk about the budget process a little bit later. And then we've got the rest of formal session, which again, we'll get into a little bit later. And then normally, again, in a standard year, July 31st in the second year of session is when formal session will end. Obviously this year, because of COVID, we've extended it, and formal session ends again tonight at quote unquote midnight. But the Beacon Hills clocks work a little odd, and sometimes it ends up being a little bit later than that.
There's really no Cinderella moment.
Yeah.
I can promise you that.
How a bill becomes a law. This is normally when I ask my interns if they're old enough to know what this picture is from, and I figure out how old I am. But so this is the bill through the legislative process. So like I said, bill gets filed in those first couple of weeks. And then the bill gets assigned to a primary committee based on subject matter. Usually the House and the Senate will agree on that. Sometimes they don't. But this is a part, if it's labor related, it's going to get assigned to labor and workforce development. If it's related to elder affairs, it'll be, or nursing homes, right? It'll get sent to elder affairs, the judiciary. I think we're all familiar with the various types of committees that there are. And then a bill gets a public hearing, right? Every bill gets a public hearing. At least every bill filed in that deadline has to have a public hearing. If you've ever been to a public hearing or watched a public hearing, you kind of know what those look like. So it doesn't mean that every bill gets an individual hearing. Usually they are lumped together by kind of subject matter, and they all get heard on one day. Usually sometime in the middle of the day, which is super inconvenient for anybody that can't take time off of work. But I think that is a different webinar. And we don't necessarily have to get into that right now. But yeah, you come in public hearing, there's public testimony. Anybody can come in and give public testimony. These are all very open hearings. And then what happens is a bill gets reported out one of a number of ways. The other thing to note is that in committee, bills can be edited and redrafted into anything that the committee wants. So the committee has a lot of power over kind of what comes out of it. But bills can get reported out generally one of three ways. It'll be reported out favorably. It will be reported out to a study, which generally is our way of kind of saying that a bill is not happening. It generally kills the bill for the session. Or rarely it'll be passed, ought not to pass. We don't usually do ought not to pass just because we like to be collegial and kind to our colleagues. But if something is especially terrible, we will, committees will give an ought not to pass as kind of a nudge to the person that filed it that this isn't going to happen, please stop. If the bill does get reported out favorably, then gets sent to a secondary committee. And it gets broken down generally this way. Again, weird things happen sometimes, but if the bill costs money, it gets sent to Ways and Means. If it costs money is related to healthcare, the secondary committee will be healthcare financing. And if it doesn't cost money, it'll be sent to the Rules Committee. And then once again, those secondary committees have the same opportunity to redraft or edit any language from any bill that's in their committee. And then that's where it gets reported out to the floor to be voted on. And I think that's the process that, some of us tend to be a little more familiar with. And that's when your legislators can file amendments and they have big debate and they vote on the amendments. And then eventually a version of the bill gets passed through the chamber. And then you do it all again in the other branch, right? So everything has to pass both the House and the Senate. And so you go through that whole process and then you do it all over again. And then what happens when those two branches don't agree, right? So if the two branches pass the same version of a bill, that's easy, simple, and then gets sent to the governor's desk. And we'll talk about what happens at the governor's desk. But if they don't, they get a conference committee. So each branch appoints 3 members to a conference committee. And that's, and they'll work it out. So if you followed the climate change bill that came out of conference committee, if you followed the police reform bill that came out of conference committee, amendments don't get filed to the initial conference report. So when conference committee reports come back to each chamber, it's a yes or no vote. So you don't get the opportunity to amend that, which is why what comes out of the conference committee is really key and really clutch to actually getting things moving. Then the bill gets sent to the governor's desk, and basically from there the bill either becomes a law or it doesn't, and it happens one of a couple of ways, right? If it becomes a law, the governor signs the bill. Obviously that becomes a quick and easy law. If he lets it sit on his desk for 10 days without a signature or veto, now there's an important caveat to that I'll talk about in a second, but if he just lets it sit without a signature for 10 days, then also becomes a law. Or the governor vetoes the bill and it's overwritten. I think it's not overridden. That's the wrong word. But the legislature can override the veto, or the governor vetoes it. Right? He can outright veto with recommended changes. There's also a pocket veto, and so that's the weird little caveat that I talked about with that 10-day window. If the end of formal session falls within that 10-day window, and the governor doesn't sign it. So basically, right, anything that happens tonight, if the governor does not sign it by midnight, it's dead, it's done. And that is a pocket veto. And so those are kind of the process. Veto powers change a little bit for the budget, which I'll talk about next. So the budget only goes through one committee, right? So there's no primary and secondary committees with the budget. It comes straight from Ways and Means. It goes onto the floor, amendments, and then it goes to the governor, just like any other bill. The difference being the governor does have a line item veto for the budget. So with other bills, the governor can send it back with suggestions. With the budget, the governor can go in and strike specific language or specific line items or reduce line items one by one. And then the legislature can override those vetoes one by one, which is right. A good example of that was the Roe Act, right? We had Roe Act language in the budget, the governor line item vetoed that, and then the legislature had to override that veto. And so that's, those are the kind of few caveats or slight differences with the budget process. And that is, like I said, so let me stop sharing my screen real quick. Sorry. Like I said, that was really that's the high level review. So I'm gonna.
Oh, we've got some questions, Mark. I've been
yes, I see.
monitoring the chat. So yeah, one question around why aren't all bills required to be brought to the floor, which, as you know, is really relevant when we see bills like the Safe Communities Act, which is around the protection of immigrant communities and immigrant individuals in Massachusetts. Yeah. How do we not see those continually come up for a vote, which I think is a great question.
It's a good, so it seems like, part of the question is there a way to change the rules? I mean, yes, right? So at the beginning of every session, they do a rules debate. They have to be voted on, and rules can change. They rarely
Yes, that's actually part of what we're trying to do.
Right, they rarely do. But I mean, the answer is yes. And why don't all bills make it? On that, your guess is as good as mine. They make it to a committee and the committee either does or does not think it's a good idea. And things can just kind of expire at the end of session. That's just, that's kind of the reality. while, obviously I understand the frustration of things continuously, dying in ways and means at the end of session. The flip side to that is logistically, how do we logistically do that, right? What happens at the end of session at, 9 o'clock on the last night of session, and we've got, I think there are 600 bills in Ways and Means, in the House Ways and Means, at least right now, 600 something bills in House Ways and Means. If those all just got thrown onto the floor right now, that's obviously just kind of a logistical nightmare for everybody. I certainly would not want 600 bills thrown at me right now that I would have to then talk to my boss about. That would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that is certainly one of the biggest frustrations, is the number of bills that just kind of die.
And that's why advocacy is so important, which we will get to later on. But Mark, there was a question about the outside sections to the budget. What are outside sections?
Yes. So in the budget, there's line items and outside sections. So line items are money, right? It's just, here's this line item, this account, and this is how much money we're going to give it. And sometimes there's some policy built into the line items, but usually it's just kind of, here's the money and here's what it has to be used for. Outside sections are really just another way to do policy. It's another way to pass laws in the budget. Now, generally, what they say is that, the outside sections have to be related to some of the stuff we're doing in the budget, or have to be somewhat budgetary related. But again, that's the difference between what is supposed to happen and what actually does happen, right? Because like I said, again, using the Roe Act, extremely happy the Roe Act passed, and it absolutely needed to, but that wasn't related to the budget really in any meaningful way. Truthfully, they'll use things not being related to the budget as a reason to say no to them, but then also submit things not related to the budget that they want to do. It's just kind of, it's the prerogative of leadership, I suppose.
And there's a lot of questions about that. What is the prerogative of leadership really influence and impact when it comes to these sorts of decisions?
Yeah. I'm trying to, so yes, someone asked about, if the governor does not sign the climate bill tonight, then it's dead. It is done for the session and we have to start all over again tomorrow. So yes, that would be potentially a pocket veto if he doesn't sign and doesn't do anything about it. Some of these make it through the committee process and are still held back by House and leadership. Why is this allowed? It's the rules, right? It's just that it's how leadership operates. I don't have a good reason for why it's allowed, right? It's just as frustrating for me as it is for all of you, but that's just kind of the reality, right? What they'll tell you, obviously, is that the membership isn't behind it and there's not enough support in the membership to do things. And sometimes that's true, right? I want to be entirely clear. I think that, in my honest opinion, and let me back up, and I should have prefaced all of this by saying that these are the views of Mark Martinez and not necessarily the views of Pat Jalen. But, I want to be clear. I think that, a lot of times leadership gets kind of saddled with the blame, and a lot of times that's deserved. But I also think that one of the things that I think we also just kind of have to accept is that our legislature across the board isn't as progressive as we would like it to be. And sometimes it really is
on
true
both the House and the Senate.
Yes,
just want to be very clear about that. Yep.
And sometimes just the membership is genuinely not there. What is the difference between leaving a bill unsigned on his desk for 10 days and a pocket veto? The difference is just the timing. The difference is whether or not that bill hits his desk within 10 days of the end of formal session. So if it hits his desk prior to 10 days before the end of session and those 10 days expire, it becomes law. If it's less than 10 days to the end of formal session and it expires. And I think part of the reason that is just, right, constitutionally, when session ends and we have to move on to a new session. And so we can't be dealing with stuff from the previous session. But like I said, that's constitutional, and short of a constitutional amendment, we can't do a whole lot about Trying to run through. So there's a couple of questions that I think, there's a questions about, how is power held by the speaker and the president, about why bills do and do not get to the floor, and why is everything bunched up at the end of session? This is, these are the rules. I think legislatures all across the country and at the federal level all desire a leadership structure, and how to get things done and how to manage a process. Why aren't they reported out in a timely fashion? I don't have an answer for that. I wish I did. If I did, and if I knew how to fix it, I would be getting paid a lot more money than I get paid right now to do that work. It's a really unfortunate thing that continuously happens, even in a world in which we've had an extended session and an extra, 6 months of formal session. I don't have a good answer for why it happens. It does. A lot of it, truthfully, I think comes down to a power struggle between the House and the Senate. There's moving pieces. There's things that the House wants and the things that the Senate wants. And, being able to trade those things to get the things that they want. It's what it comes down to. Unfortunately, it's a really dangerous game, in my opinion, and a game where they're playing with people's lives. And it's, I'll be the first one to tell you, most days I really love my job, but sometimes it's really hard to watch things unfold the way that they unfold. Is there a state nonpartisan office or state agency that provides plain language summaries of proposed bills? No, that's just the honest. There's not. What I will say is, for the most part, at least for the bigger bills, if you contact your elected officials' offices for summaries, we normally have some type of summary on, like I said, especially the bigger stuff. So please use this for a resource. If you don't understand something, you're struggling to understand what's in a bill. Like I said, I write bills for a living. I'm a lawyer, and I still get tripped up on the way some of these things are written. So please use us as a resource, especially if you are in the 2nd Middlesex District and you are represented by Pat Jalen, give us a call. I will be happy to help you. If the ROAC was not related to the budget, why was it in there? Because they wanted it to be, and they didn't have, I think that's really just kind of it. They, like I said, the budget gets used for a lot of things, and that's just kind of the vehicle that they decided to use.
And there's also sometimes there's also a consideration around if it's in a certain committee, right, like Ways and Means or Judiciary, there may be members of that committee who are not for that bill and are putting pressure to not get a vote at this moment, even from committee. So by having leadership do it through the budget, where, there's so many things going on in the budget, for legislators who are maybe not supportive, but leadership on both the House and the Senate has some sort of responsibility to members across the political spectrum. That is tough for me. I will definitely be frank about that, but they have some responsibility to those members, and sometimes moves from, a vehicle, a legislative vehicle to a budget vehicle is in ways to maintain those relationships with members and across the political spectrum. So I do want to talk about, and that kind of gets us into the strategy piece. I know there's some more questions around
I want
the
to just
process.
quickly run through a couple questions. So someone is saying the governor has until January 13th to sign the climate bill. I want to be clear. I could be wrong. I will look into that, and if someone wants to send some resources on where they have that information, I, of course, would be happy to take that. I would very happy to be wrong in this instance, but my understanding is a little different. Will I share the slides? I will send the slides to Jen, and then y'all can do whatever you want with those. Is there a list of members of the various caucuses, such as the Progressive Caucus? No, they're actually really informal caucuses, so there's not formal lists posted anywhere. Most sensitive times have an impact on legislation. I think that's something Maya will talk about in a minute. Sorry, I'm trying to. Can the league have any impact on how the rules are drafted at the beginning of session? I mean, so the rules go through, the same process as any bill does, right? They're still debated on the floor. They're still published. So you can absolutely contact your elected officials regarding rules changes the way you would amendments or thoughts on any bill. It happens usually at the beginning of session. It's usually the first thing that gets done. So absolutely, you can do that. Is the upcoming session the first or second year? It's the first. So we're going to be starting fresh with the first year of the session. There's not necessarily anything specifically significant about the first year of the session. It's just, a lot of stuff happens at the beginning of session, and then end of session is the second year. So there's no specific, like I said, significance. So 1 year versus first year versus the second. Lynn, you said bills are submitted in the first 2 years of the legislative session. I think you meant first 2 weeks. And if so, how do new members get on board quickly with this? That is a constant struggle.
And that's one of the things that we've identified in Beacon Block is a way that actually for legislators of color, legislators who are not, this is their first time, women, parents, it makes the experience so much more harder to go from immediately being a candidate to be a legislator and then have to show up and represent your constituents legislatively within 2 weeks on the job. So it is really tough. And there's no good reason.
Yep. All right, I don't see any other questions on here for me. So I am going to turn it over to Maya to talk about.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. So prior to being the legislative director for Senator Chang Diaz, I was an organizer. So that means I was the person who was organizing folks like yourselves to come into the State House and talk to staffers, talk to legislators. And so I think a lot of the questions y'all were asking Mark around the process is really getting into the strategic part of organizing and advocacy, which is so important to the State House to making things actually move. One of the great things I like about working with Senator Chang Diaz is she actually comes from an organizing background as well. So we are, as an office, really receptive to building up capacity of our constituents to go into the State House and making sure that their voices and demands are heard. And so, I can do a quick primer on kind of best advocacy steps, let's say if you are in a lobby day, and then I'll go into more in-depth and use kind of a case study from this past session. So, when you are advocating for something and we're using non-COVID times, I will say that we've had several virtual lobby days where I think have gone pretty well. But when you're coming to the State House to talk to a legislative office about an issue, one of the most important things to remember is that you may not talk to that legislator, but that doesn't mean that your message is not getting across. As a staffer for 3 years and as someone who represents a staff-led organization, I can tell you that staffers are a direct connection to legislators. And obviously, it's very different to be getting a brush off versus, they're just not available or not here. But I know some folks get disappointed or feel like their message isn't going to get across if you talk to a staffer. And just want to let you know from my experience, that can actually be one of the most efficient ways to get information in your advocacy out there. And so, most offices on the Senate have multiple staff. And so you really want to find out who is a staffer who is dealing with the issue that you're concerned about. On the House side, it's different because they typically only have 1 or 2 staffers. So that staffer is really doing everything. And so that's also something that we really focus on Beacon Block, is looking at that imbalance. But it's super important because there are so many bills in the legislature to have all the information about the bill, not just the number and title, but who has sponsored it, what is the current position of the bill, and just going back to what I said earlier about finding the right staffer to speak with. One of the best ways to do that is if you're setting up a meeting is really to just ask. If the legislator isn't available, making sure to ask, well, can I speak to the staffer who is in charge, or the point person is a term used a lot on the State House on Beacon Hill, for this issue. So that's a really great way to do that. So making sure you know where the position of the bill is, for organizing and advocacy, we get advocacy every day, right? People are calling us, emailing us, and letting them know their opinions on a day-to-day basis, which is great and so important. But then when you also think strategically about how can I make sure that this advocacy that's coming from my community or from communities like mine across Massachusetts is making the most impact, we really like to say high impact days, like advocacy days or lobby days, where everyone is coming to the State House to speak around one issue. And usually that has an ask related to movement of a bill, right? So in the beginning of the session, I see I'm breaking up a little bit. In the beginning of the session, when bills are in the committee process and nothing has really moved forward yet, advocacy really looks like we need to have an early hearing for this bill. We need to move this out of committee as fast as possible, because that's the first step. And as you said, it is true that a lot of bills die in committee. Having worked in a legislative committee, the Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities, the Committee on Cannabis Policy, and the Education Committee, I can tell you that while the committee chairs definitely have a lot of say in that process, it also, you have to take into account the other committee members. So when thinking about advocacy earlier on in the session, before things have really moved in the committee process, if you are basically just asking, look, this bill, in those first few months, it's really important to get feedback, because you have so much time in the legislative process. Something that I've learned in my experience within the legislature and as an advocate, if you ask, okay, what can we do to get this bill out of your committee? Particularly as people have mentioned, there are bills that have been in the same committee kind of languishing year after year. So I can use the Safe Communities Act as an example. If you are a legislator on Beacon Hill, you know about the Safe Communities Act. So rather than spending time letting them know what it is, I think it's important to spend that time letting them know what needs to be done to get this out of committee, and getting that feedback and taking it from there. One of the things that we experience in our office during the debates around education funding was that year after year, the bill wouldn't make it out of committee because there was just so much disagreement on what needed to be changed. And we weren't looking at, okay, how do we just get this to be something all these 13 or 11 folks on the committee can agree to versus the entire legislature. So that is one piece at the beginning of the session. That is a really good way for advocacy to look like, also bringing in personal stories. One of the things that I always maintain is that people don't remember, what you said to them, but they remember how they made you feel. That's from my namesake, Maya Angelou, a terrible riff. I'm sure I messed up the quote, but personal stories really help making sure that your legislator and the staff that you're talking to, you're not just another brightly colored flyer, but they remember, okay, I was talking to this young woman or this person about the Roe Act, and they told me not just about why they support it, but also their experience supporting a friend who had to cross state lines to get an abortion. And so that is something that's going to stick with the legislator more so sometimes than some of the details. And I think something else that's also really important is making sure that before you leave that interaction, you have a way to follow up with the senator, but also the staffer directly, and they have a way to follow up with you as well. That is super, super important. So let's say your bill is passed out of committee. Woohoo, congrats, the bill is out of committee. That next step is very murky, like Mark mentioned, right? It could go to Ways and Means, it could go straight to third reading, it could go to the Rules Committee, but let's say it goes to Ways and Means because that's where most bills go. So just to make this as realistic as possible. So the Ways and Means Committee is chaired by one person. And unlike most committees, there is obviously a House counterpart, but there is not a functioning joint committee on Ways and Means. So when a bill is before Ways and Means, it's either before the Senate Ways and Means or House Ways and Means. And so when dealing with Ways and Means, they get most of the bills and legislation. So they are thinking more broadly, sometimes big picture. And I think with advocacy to Ways and Means, it's really important to also bring that big picture as well, and say, how does your bill fit into the big picture for Massachusetts, whether that's, filling our gaps in revenue due to coronavirus, or how the climate bill will make some real needed health equity impacts during a time where we're seeing such great health disparities. So really bringing that bigger picture aspect. And something that's really important, Ways and Means also has staff. And each Ways and Means office has a series of analysts that are assigned to analyze and track issue areas. So, there's an analyst for housing and economic development, there's an analyst for climate and transportation and things like that. So it's really important to be connected with that person, and also finding out, what is their feedback and what can be done to move this along. Because in the Ways and Means Committee, there is an entire committee of legislators, and it's important to also know where your allies are at. So if you have, if you notice that a co-sponsor of the ROE Act, for example, is a member of the Ways and Means Committee, reaching out to them and say, hey, as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, can I count on you to be pushing the Ways and Means chair to bring this to a committee vote and reporting it out. And so that's an example of a very direct ask of a legislator. And that's something that is super important to have to make sure that you can hold them accountable. But also on the flip side, there are so many moving parts to legislation. And what we do in that building, having a very direct ask on a specific issue rather than, can you pass this bill? Makes it much more likely that you'll get a affirmative response or some sort of follow-up. So yeah, so at that Ways and Means stage, definitely knowing your allies is important. At this stage, there is more of a chance that your bill will make it to the finish line. So I think one of the things that's super important is making sure that you are in close communication with the office that is the lead sponsor, and really starting to build out a coalition. One of the things that is super important in advocacy is that, one organization can't do it all. So we really need to, work together with allied organizations. You see a lot of organizations having shared issues and signing on to each other's letters and things like that. And that does definitely make a difference. If we see a letter urging us to do something from 10 organizations is different than 50. So just thinking about that piece. Also, when you're thinking about at this point, really thinking statewide implications is really important as well. And I know, being from Boston, that is super important for all of the areas of the state, because I think that the greater Boston area definitely gets a lot of attention in the legislature. So just being real about that. And in our scenario, our bill gets moved out of Senate Ways and Means. Hurrah, we are super amped. It is the end of the first year of the legislative session, so we've got a whole year left. That is, like an eternity. Sometimes it can feel like in legislative years. And really, if something is getting reported out of Ways and Means, I'll say there is a very high likelihood that it will be coming to the floor, or that there will be some sort of upward movement on that. I can give an example of when a bill has been reported out of Ways and Means and then has not come to the floor. There was a bill filed this session and several sessions before around mandating free phone calls for incarcerated folks and their families. Right now, prison phone call rates are exorbitant. People are spending $100 a month, just hundreds of dollars a month, excuse me, just to be able to speak to their loved ones. And the bill, was reported out of the committee. It was actually reported out of the Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities Committee, which is why I know very closely about this issue. And so it got full support from our committee, except for one abstention. So one committee member did not vote. And then, this was after the Senate had done its police reform debate, and there was a lot of movement around further action on racial justice and criminal justice reform. And so this bill was reported out of Children and Families, went to Ways and Means, and was reported out of the Ways and Means Committee, and then didn't come to the floor. One of the things that was strained was not only was it reported out of the Ways and Means Committee, but it was also open for amendments. And so typically when you get to that part of the process where a bill is put into the orders of the day is what we call it. The orders of the day, if you ever want to see, okay, what is potential to come up in either the Senate or House session, that is going to be on the orders of the day. And you can find that on the clerk's website. On the House and Senate clerk keep separate websites and separate orders of the day. And it was removed from the orders of the day. And basically that bill has gone nowhere. And that's been, and I mentioned the committee vote and things like that to let you know how wide support it has gotten. And so that's one of those issues where you are kind of seeing some of those behind the scene forces. And what I'll tell you is what really happened is when legislators take votes that really put themselves out there, quote unquote, there sometimes is a backlash where then there are no more of those quote unquote tough votes. So as an advocate, thinking strategically about how do we make sure we are working effectively together, that we are framing these votes as not tough votes to make room for more progressive votes to come. And so I think that's something that is a part of the strategy that I didn't know until I got more into the legislative side of things. And just want to speak to Sharon's question. So the Speaker and Senate President essentially do have sole discretion of what comes before the legislature for a vote, what comes on those orders of the day. So that is potentially up to them and their leadership team, which includes the Ways and Means Chair, the Majority Leader, the Whip, and things like that. But at the end of the day, it truly really does lie with the Senate President and Speaker. So with that, I want to just make sure there is, Sharon, you are right there. I want to make sure I leave some time for questions. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer any in the chat, or if anyone wants to just shoot any questions out.
Yeah, real quick, Lynn asked a question that I think isn't a good question about, I think Lynn's basically asking about kind of like these mass emails that we get, right? When organizations are like, these are the talking points, or sometimes like a click this button, you can email your legislator, and is that useful? I think it can be. One of the good things about that is, depending on the office, I know my office has a database system that we manage. And so when we get 100 emails on a specific topic, we're able to look and say, well, 100 people have contacted us to support this thing. What I will say is that if at all possible, I think the one-click sending isn't as effective. I think having uniform talking points are fine, but I think, Maya alluded to this. Include something about why it's important to you, right? Like, what is it specifically? How does it connect to you? If you listen to my boss talk about, the legislative process at all, what she will always say is that stories are the most important and the most powerful thing. So, using the kind of form talking points are totally fine to talk about what's in this bill, why is it important. But if you can, and if you have a personal story that you're comfortable sharing, that's what's going to engage your senators and your reps, because they're going to know this wasn't just like a form email that someone clicked and went on about their day. This is, something that people have spent time on, and something that's really important to them.
And I will also add that also when reading those, because we have a similar system as well, when reading those, that also allows us to not just have a different perspective of your ask, but also some that can further a connection between you and your legislator. I know sometimes when the senator is reading emails from people that really speak to her, or it seems like they may need some additional support, we reach out. And so that is also kind of a way to have that back and forth with your legislator. I would definitely say those mass emails are important. I would say one of the most effective ones I've seen recently was from the Housing for All advocates. I think they had really, really effective mass email techniques in terms of incorporating personal stories and talking points and things like that. So yeah, that would be an example. And I see there's a question about when can we expect committee assignments to be finalized?
Yeah.
Great question. I would like to know what I'm spending 2 years of my life focused on. But unfortunately, that might be end of January, middle of February even.
Yeah, it might even be a little bit later. So I know at the beginning of this session, it took a little bit later because it was Senate President Spilka's first real full session and her first time appointing committees. And obviously we're gonna have the same thing with new Speaker Mariano. And truthfully, the other thing that I just wanna throw out as a very real possibility is COVID is still a thing. And so, weird things could happen, and there's, definitely a possibility they just kind of like extend current committees. Anything could happen in COVID times. I think Jean Morrison, this isn't necessarily a question, but you made a larger point that I think is really important, is the public does need to know, right? And I think that is where transparency is really important. I don't think transparency is the only answer. I think there are a lot of people that think that, once you kind of pull the covers back in the State House, everything's going to be fine. I think the truth is that once you pull the covers back, we're going to be kind of horrified at what we see. But we need to know what's there. And I absolutely, I think the first step is absolutely transparency. And so, people can't hide behind leadership and say, well, leadership wanted this or they didn't. And that was kind of the end of it. We absolutely do need mechanisms to keep our elected officials accountable. Yeah, Sharon, it's not democratic at all. If someone blocks a floor debate about a bill that was reported out favorably Ways and Means, can it be put back early in the next session? No, once a new session starts, like we have to start fresh. Like we can't carry things.
But as advocates, one of the most important things to say is, hey, this bill reported out of Ways and Means, literally people filed amendments to it. What happened? So close. Would love to get that moving quickly. And letting leadership know that from jump is a really good strategy to put pressure. Like, we didn't forget about what happened here, and to let them know this was a very popular bill. We have a new crop of folks here. We have 2 new senators in the Senate, and I believe there's around 25 new representatives. So to really put that into perspective from them is what I've seen as helpful advocacy to leadership. And then for members, particularly progressive members, just letting them know, hey, this got so close last time. We need you in this fight so we can get it all the way, is a really good sort of refrain around that. But yeah, unfortunately, everything gets sent back.
Yeah. If
Like at
someone
a
blocks a bill that is
Blockbuster,
supported by
kind
committee,
rewind.
can be made public who blocked it and why. Generally, when you block a bill, it's a procedural thing that happens on the Senate or House floor. So it is generally known who does it. It's usually, that part usually isn't super secret. As far as the speaker and the Senate president, those people can absolutely, they can absolutely be pressured. Is testimony important in moving something forward? Do they read it? I can only speak for the committee that I'm on, and Maya seems to agree. Yes. I think that,
read it.
I
It's
know
similar to an email, right? Like you're putting in that personal touch and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of issues that, like I said, again, I can only speak for my boss, but my boss generally goes into a lot of issues, with questions, and testimony is a really great way to get questions answered. When legislators receive a lot of emails on a topic, do they keep a pro and con count? Yeah, my office does. And in most offices that I know absolutely do. How do Senators Chang Diaz and Jalen feel about meeting with organizers who were not their constituents? I think we'll take meetings, right? I think the first thing is the staff will always take meetings. Getting the actual senator in a meeting can be a little more tricky. Obviously, being a constituent is obviously always more of a compelling reason. But also, if it's on an issue that the senator is really passionate about, or a really important issue, she'll absolutely meet with people from outside of the district that are organizing for specific issues. What is more effective or preferred, emails versus phone calls, or both? What I'll say right now in COVID times is that emails are better, just because everything goes to a
I
voicemail.
was just gonna say.
And it takes a long time to kind of get through all of those voicemails. And so email, I think right now, is generally easier. And even I would say in normal
My
times.
rule of thumb is, I was just gonna say I usually do 2 emails. If I haven't heard back from you and I want to follow up, then a phone call. Then we get chatting on the phone.
Emails are always good, just because it's always something for us to refer back to. And it's always easy to make sure that we are getting the points that you want across, and not forgetting things, right? I'll take notes on phone calls, but sometimes they're a little off. Do letters from town committees have a greater effect from individuals and constituents? I wouldn't, it depends on the issue, really. Obviously, having like a legislative body or something contact the legislator is big, and it's going to, get their attention. Does the pro and con count have weight for the legislators? I think it depends on the issue, right? Like, if we want to, I keep on going back to the Roe Act just because it's, I think it's easy for, conversation topics, right? We got plenty of con calls for the Roe Act. My boss has supported the right to choose for her entire career, and I don't see that changing regardless of how many people contact her. And I think lots of legislators have those issues that are just kind of like, this is what I believe, and you're either going to like it or you're not. Other things, absolutely. There are lots of issues that aren't as clear cut and aren't as straightforward, or aren't necessarily my boss's, kind of wheelhouse, where those pros and cons lists can absolutely, the kind of count of those absolutely weigh really heavily on her decision on how to vote on something or what to advocate for. So I think, it really depends. Once a bill makes it to the floor, does testimony get read or seen beyond the committee by the main body? If anyone can request, testimony doesn't get automatically sent to everybody, but we have people contact us for testimony on specific bills that were heard before our committee all the time if people are interested. So you can certainly do that. Can you set up Google Alerts on bills as a way to track them? Not only if people are reporting it. What you can do is, and I've not used this feature, so I want to be clear that I'm not sure how great it is. But on the legislature's website, you can create like a My Legislature account and like favorite and track certain bills. Like I said, I don't want to I can't say how well that system works, but I know it exists. Just want to make sure. So you can do that, absolutely. And Lynn, sounds if we want to get that phone bill passed, we have about a week to advocate to our legislators that it be resubmitted. I think it's going to be resubmitted, right? I don't want to speak for Senator Chang Diaz's office, but I am pretty certain that if it does not become law, their office will be refiling that bill. And so, you know, I don't think the issue is lobbying someone to file it, but it's going to be lobbying the legislators to get behind it.
Great, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful event. We really thank Maya and Mark for their expertise. That's really awesome. So we'll make sure everyone who registered receives the video, and we can also put it on our website. So thank you again, Mark, so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, Jen has our contact information, both our individual and the Beacon BLOC Gmail account. So if you would like that, please feel free to reach out. And, you know, we're happy to answer any questions that we can.
Great, thank you. Okay, Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year, everyone. Oh, jinx. Bye.
Bye.